I'm in a predicament right now that I'm struggling to make sense of. I don't know where to turn or who to confide in, but I feel like I have to get this off my chest, even if it makes me sound paranoid, even if it makes me question my own sanity. I'll start at the beginning as best as I can remember it. 5 years ago, my neighbor Charlie as I call him, came to me and my wife with devastating news. His 14-year-old son had gone missing. The boy, named Evan, had simply disappeared one evening without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no ransom note, just an empty room and a family in agony. Charles reported it immediately. The police came and did their thing, but they found nothing. It was on the news, covered by local stations for weeks, but there were no leads, no evidence, just an empty hole where a boy once was. My wife and I, of course, were heartbroken for them. We offered to help in any way we could, but Charles and his wife Kathy were understandably withdrawn. As the months turned to years and still no word of Evan, we assumed they had come to terms with the unthinkable, that their son was gone. We couldn't even imagine what they were going through, and we never had the nerve to ask if the body had been found. Occasionally, Charles and Kathy would invite us over for a barbecue during the warmer months. We'd sit in the backyard, eating burgers and trying to make light conversation, but it was always clear something had changed in them. Kathy, once so talkative and vibrant, had become eerily quiet. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, her words had a certain hollow quality, as if her heart had been stolen from her years ago. Charles wasn't much better. He was jittery, always shifting his weight from foot to foot, never quite looking anyone in the eye. He was like a man who was constantly waiting for something bad to happen, like he was on edge, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. I didn't blame them. I could only imagine the toll it had taken on them both. But then, last week, something happened that made my blood run cold. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was taking out the garbage when Charles came over to me, looking uncharacteristically tense. He asked if he could borrow a shovel. Without thinking, I told him I'd get it for him. I didn't ask what he needed it for. It was a neighborly request, and I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my best shovel from the shed and handed it to him. He thanked me and said he'd bring it back the next day, then disappeared into his backyard without another word. Later that evening, when I was up in the spare bedroom of our house, which has a clear view into Charles's backyard, I noticed something strange. Charles was out there, digging a large hole in the ground. He was struggling, his movements slow and labored, like the weight of the shovel was too much for him. He's 56 after all, not a young man anymore. I figured he was just doing some landscaping or yard work, but something about the way he was digging felt off. It wasn't just a casual dig. It was deep. Too deep for a garden bed. I couldn't help myself. I grabbed my second shovel and went over to offer him some help. I called out to him as I entered his backyard, but when he saw me, his face twisted with an expression I can only describe as panic. He dropped the shovel and hurried over to me, almost frantic. No, it's fine," he said in a shaky voice. "I've got it. Please, just leave." I was taken aback. His response was so strange, so aggressive, it made my skin crawl. I could tell he wasn't being entirely honest with me. There was something he didn't want me to see, something he didn't want me to know. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though I was growing more uncomfortable by the second. "It's not a big deal. Let me help." But Charles's face hardened, and he pointed to the gate of his backyard as if I were some sort of intruder. "I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard," he said, his voice low and trembling. "Please, leave." I had no idea what to say to that, so I just turned around and left. The whole encounter felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I went upstairs and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. From the window I could see Charles continuing to dig. But now, I was watching him more closely, more suspiciously. I kept my eyes on him for a while, but eventually he stopped digging. He looked around his backyard, his eyes scanning the neighboring houses as if to check that no one was watching. And then, just as I was about to pull away from the window, He spotted me. Our eyes met. He didn't say anything. He didn't wave or even nod. He just stared at me for a moment before walking inside, leaving the hole half dug and the shovel abandoned. I couldn't get it out of my mind. What was he doing out there? Why was he so desperate to keep me away? I didn't get any answers that night, but I wasn't about to let it go. At 1:30 a.m., I was lying in bed when I heard the unmistakable sound of a shovel hitting the dirt. I knew Charles was back outside. My heart pounded in my chest. I crept quietly out of bed, making sure I didn't wake my wife, and snuck to the window. The moonlight was faint, but I could see him again, this time working much faster, as though he was in a hurry. I had to know what he was hiding. I had to find out what was in that hole. I grabbed my jacket and tiptoed out into the yard, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the fence separating our backyards, I peered over it, my breath catching in my throat. There it was. The hole was much deeper now, and at the bottom I saw something that made my blood run cold. A piece of black garbage bag was visible, sticking out of the dirt. My mind raced. Was it possible? Was it something Charles had buried? Was it Evan? I stood there, frozen, caught between the urge to look closer and the nagging fear that I was about to uncover something terrible. After what felt like an eternity, I turned back toward my house, my instincts screaming at me to get away. But just as I made to move, I heard a noise from inside Charles' house. He was coming back outside. I scrambled back into my own yard, ducking down low to avoid being seen. I heard Charles's footsteps growing fainter as he moved to the other side of his house. For a moment I considered going back to the hole, but I didn't. I had already seen enough. I knew enough. The next day I woke up to find that the hole had been completely filled in. The earth had been carefully tamped down as if nothing had ever happened. Charles's SUV was parked in the street, not his driveway, which struck me as odd. He hadn't come over to return my shovel either. I didn't know what to think. What had been in that hole? What had he been hiding? I had a sickening feeling deep in my gut that I would never get answers. And now a new problem had cropped up. Yesterday, while I was standing by the window, I looked over at Charles' house and saw him. He was standing in his own window, staring directly at me. I froze. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and then, without a word, he shut the blinds. It was broad daylight. He had no reason to be watching me. But he was, and I'm terrified. Terrified of what he might be hiding, terrified of what I might have uncovered, and terrified of what might happen if I press for answers. I haven't told my wife. I haven't told anyone, and I don't know what to do. I've lived in 3 different houses in my life, each marking a different chapter. The first was the house I grew up in, where I spent the first 15 years of my life with my family. The second, a place we lived in for another 7 years before I moved out to my current home. But it's the first house, the one where everything started, that still haunts me to this day. The memory is vivid, and even now, I sometimes hear whispers at night that make my skin crawl. It was the final few months of living in that house when the events began to unfold. Our family wasn't close with the neighbors, never had been, never would be. There was a house next door with a father and 2 boys, Eric and Todd. I don't know why we never really interacted, but our families never really spoke beyond pleasantries. In fact, I can count the number of times I'd spoken to either of them on one hand. And bizarrely, despite living next door all these years, I never really knew much about them. I only knew their names because they were on the mailboxes, but I had no idea what their lives were like. One afternoon, my brother and I were playing basketball on our driveway, minding our own business. My brother, 5 years younger than me, wasn't really great at the game, but we had fun. It was one of those lazy, warm days, and the rhythmic bouncing of the ball was calming. That's when Todd, the older of the 2 boys, came over. At first we didn't know what he wanted, but then he asked us if it was true that we were moving. I wasn't sure how to respond, but as the older brother, I took charge of the conversation. I don't remember the details of the exchange, but I distinctly recall the curiosity in his eyes as he asked, "Are you guys really leaving?" It was odd because I hadn't heard anything about it. My parents hadn't mentioned anything to us, but when I asked, Todd said he'd overheard his dad talking about it. I didn't put much thought into it at the time. After all, rumors happen. But then came the offer. And this was the part that still feels wrong. Todd asked if we wanted to come shoot BB guns with him and Eric at the river, down in the woods. It was an odd invitation, considering we didn't even know these boys that well, but we were 15 and 10 years old, respectively, and the thought of getting to hang out with older kids seemed exciting. I told my brother he could come along too, though I didn't really think he would be invited. But Todd agreed, and after a moment's hesitation, we were on our way. When Todd and Eric showed up at our door later that afternoon, they were dressed in full camo gear, looking like they were preparing for something serious. They each carried a duffel bag, and my brother and I exchanged puzzled glances. Why the camo? Why the duffel bags? It all seemed too intense for two kids our age. Still, we were eager for adventure, and without saying much, we followed them down the road toward the woods. As we got deeper into the trees, we barely spoke. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't quite figure out why it felt so off. Finally, Todd dropped the duffel bag onto the ground and unzipped it. The first thing I noticed were the guns. Real guns. He pulled out a couple of handguns and handed them to me and my brother. My heart dropped. They weren't BB guns. They were real, fully loaded pistols. Eric, with a sadistic grin on his face, took out another gun from the bag and started firing at the trees across the river. My mind was racing. I was horrified. These kids weren't just playing. They were dangerous. I grabbed the gun from my brother's hands and shoved both of them back into the bag, telling Todd we weren't comfortable with this. We had to leave, but Todd didn't take too kindly to our objections. His expression darkened, and for the first time I saw something cold in his eyes. Eric stopped firing, and they both looked at us with scorn. One of them shouted a curse at us as we turned to leave. It was a warning shot, metaphorically speaking. My gut told me these kids were bad news, and this incident confirmed it. That night, my brother and I told our parents about the boys next door and their strange behavior. But we didn't mention the guns. There was no need to cause a panic, I thought. It was just a misunderstanding. We didn't realize how wrong we were. I went to bed that night, still shaken by what had happened, but trying to push it from my mind. That's when it all began. I woke up in the middle of the night, the air around me unusually cold. A draft was blowing through my open window. As I sat up, I felt something hard press against the back of my head, and a voice whispered in my ear, "Shh." It was Todd. In a voice barely above a whisper, he told me that if I ever told anyone, especially his dad, about what happened with the guns, he would come back and kill me and my entire family. I didn't know what to say. I was terrified. My heart raced, and all I could manage was a quiet, shaky, "Okay." He pushed my head with the barrel of the gun before backing away and slipping out of my window. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a dream. It was real. For the next few months, the terror didn't stop. Every night I would hear or see something. Either Todd or Eric would be lurking in the shadows, standing outside my window or my brother's window, staring in. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. Sometimes I'd catch them laughing softly to themselves as they watched us, and I could feel their eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. Then a week before we moved, it got worse. One night around 1 a.m., a rock was thrown at my window. I opened it cautiously, just a crack, to see what was going on. That's when I saw Todd, standing there with a pistol aimed directly at me. My stomach dropped. I thought I was going to die right there. But then the two boys burst into laughter. They were playing some sick game, and I was the punchline. "You're a expletive," one of them shouted, still laughing. I could hear the malice in their voices, but I didn't dare respond. I just shut the window and locked it tight. It wasn't the only time that week. There were 2 more instances where they harassed me and my brother, and every time, the fear tightened in my chest. It was like living in a nightmare where there was no escape. Finally, the day came when we left that house. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders as we drove away. My family never knew the full extent of what had happened. We never told anyone about the boys or their threats. What was the point? After all these years, I've never spoken about it to anyone. I couldn't. Who would believe me? Who would understand? I often wonder what happened to Todd and Eric. Were they ever caught? Did they grow up to become something worse? I don't know, and part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know one thing for sure. Those boys were troubled, deeply so, and it's a good thing we got out of there when we did, because I'm not sure we would have survived much longer. It's strange how some things from your past seem to stay with you, like dark stains you can't quite scrub away no matter how hard you try. The events I'm about to tell you happened just 2 weeks ago, but even now, as I sit at my desk trying to focus on the screen in front of me, my mind keeps wandering back to that night. I can't shake it. Not the images, not the sounds, not the feeling of someone watching me when I'm alone in my own home. I'm a recent college graduate, and like most people my age, I found myself caught between two worlds: excitement at my newfound independence and the harsh reality of adult responsibilities. Money's tight, as it always is when you're just starting out, and the only house I could afford was in a neighborhood that most people would avoid if they had the choice. The neighbors on one side of my house are what you'd expect in a bad area. People who play music so loudly you can hear it vibrating through the walls day and night. But on the other side, things are far worse. The house next to mine is occupied by two women who are by far the strangest people I've ever encountered. There's the older woman, probably in her 60s. She's always got this eerie, vacant look in her eyes. I've seen her several times standing at her window, staring out into the street without moving for hours, as if she's forgotten how to blink. Her demeanor is off-putting, and honestly, she gives me the chills whenever I cross paths with her. Then, there's the younger woman, maybe in her 30s, but she seems much older mentally. She has severe mental disabilities, and I'm not sure what her relationship to the older woman is, but it's disturbing. She's always screaming or having these fits, rocking back and forth, shouting incomprehensible words. I don't know if the two women are family or if they're just living together out of convenience, but I've seen enough to know that something's very wrong in that house. Most of the time, I try to ignore them, plug my earbuds in and tune out the constant noise from next door. But there are times when I can't ignore it. It was one of those nights, a week or so ago, when things reached a breaking point. I had to get up early for work the next day, and I was exhausted. The house next door was louder than usual, with the younger woman screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice high-pitched and frantic. I tried to ignore it at first, but after an hour of her shrieking and the older woman's constant yelling back, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on my hoodie, marched over to their house, and banged on the door. When the older woman opened it, her face was like a mask, emotionless. "What the hell do you want?" she snapped at me, clearly annoyed. I explained as politely as I could that the noise was disturbing and that I needed them to keep it down. Instead of an apology or any form of understanding, she just raised her eyebrows, tilting her head down like she was trying to judge me. Then, without warning, the younger woman appeared in the living room. She was screaming, her voice piercing the air. "How dare you!" she yelled repeatedly. The older woman grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to hold her back, but there was no stopping the chaos. She slammed the door in my face without saying another word. I stood there for a moment, stunned. What was that about? I felt like I hadn't gotten anywhere with my complaint. My heart was racing, but I just turned and walked back to my house, frustrated and confused. When I got back inside, I was almost relieved to hear that the noise had stopped. Finally, some peace. I went to bed hoping to catch some sleep before work, but as soon as I laid my head on the pillow, I felt like something was off. I looked over at the clock, 3 a.m. My body was exhausted, but sleep felt elusive. I tried to shake it off, but as I lay there, something felt wrong. I heard a faint sound coming from downstairs. Footsteps, maybe? I waited for a moment, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. I got up, checked the door, and found nothing out of place. Relieved, I crawled back into bed, hoping I was just imagining things. But I wasn't. Just 20 minutes later, I woke up again. my room still pitch black. I didn't know what had woken me up. At first I thought maybe it was the wind, but then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft shuffling sound, like someone was moving around in my room. My heart skipped a beat. In a panic, I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, hoping to use the light to help me see. But as I turned it on, I didn't dare shine the light around the room. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like there was something in the room with me. Something not right. I scanned the corners of the room. There was nothing. No shadowy figures, no movement, just darkness. Then, it hit me. From the corner of the bed, at the edge where the wall met the bed, I saw it. A dark shape like a shadow, but so much more. I turned my phone light toward it and froze. It was her, the deranged woman from next door. Her face, pale, wide-eyed, and twisted with madness, was pressed up against the edge of the bed. She screamed. It was a guttural, piercing sound like something out of a nightmare. I was paralyzed for a split second, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. And then, instinct took over. I screamed. I scrambled out of bed, tripping on the floor in my panic, but I didn't look back. I ran for the door, nearly slamming it open as I barreled down the hallway. But just as I reached the stairs, I heard her footsteps behind me. Closer now, louder, like she was chasing me. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran to the downstairs door, securing it as well. I didn't know what to do. Was this some kind of twisted game? What was she doing in my house? I immediately called the cops. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I explained the situation in as much detail as I could. My voice was shaking, and I could hear the panic in it. But the more I spoke, the more I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a random intruder. The pounding on the door didn't stop. She was still there, screaming incomprehensible things. It sounded like she was trying to break the door down. By the time the cops arrived, the older woman from next door had come over, trying to plead with the officers. She looked at me with a cold expression, her face twisted into something that could only be described as pure hatred. She argued with the cops, insisting that her daughter wasn't dangerous, that she was harmless. One of the officers asked me if I wanted to press charges, but as I turned to look at the older woman, I could see the intensity of her stare. It was as if her eyes could burn through me. Her hate-filled glare was enough to make me hesitate. I shook my head. No, I don't want to press charges. Just get her out of here. The officers insisted on taking the younger woman in for the night, despite the older woman's protests. They drove her away, but that look, the one she gave me as she walked back to her house, lingered. I don't know what happened after that. The older woman got into her car and drove off, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. Now, as I sit here writing this, I'm thinking about moving out. I can't shake the feeling that the deranged woman next door isn't just a terrifying presence, but a dangerous one. And every time I pass their house, I wonder if they're watching me, plotting their next move. The worst part is that I'm not sure what the older woman meant when she looked at me with that pure, venomous hate. Was it a warning? Or was it something worse? I don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before I find out.